What's the difference between men and women? Well, how do they differ? Well, the first thing we might observe is that if you look at personality differences between prepubescent boys and girls, they're not very large. Boys and girls don't differ in terms of their trait neuroticism, for example. What happens is that when puberty kicks in, women's trait neuroticism rises, and it stays higher than men for the rest of their life. And this is why you see this reflected in the different kinds of psychopathology that beset the two sexes. So men are overrepresented in alcoholism, drug abuse, antisocial personality, and a host of learning disorders, as well as attention deficit disorder. And women are overrepresented in depression and anxiety, primarily. That seems to be tightly associated with higher levels of trait neuroticism, because maybe it's, if you're at the 95th percentile or higher, let's say, in trait neuroticism, there isn't much difference between that and being somewhat prone to depression and anxiety. And because the curves overlap, you know, the curves aren't identical, the normal distributions aren't identical for men and women, you tilt the one to the right, to the women's curve to the right towards higher levels of neuroticism. You go out and you look for the person in 20 who has the highest levels of negative emotion. It's much more likely to be female than male. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out why. So I'm going to tell you some things, basic differences between men and women, and you can tell me what you think about it if you agree or disagree. Okay, first, size differential emerges between men and women at puberty, right? Because boys and girls are roughly the same size and roughly the same strength, but men get bigger at puberty when the testosterone kicks in, and more importantly, not only do they get taller and heavier, but their upper body strength is much higher. And that's a real issue for combat, because human beings punch. There's other animals that do that. Kangaroos do that too, eh? So we're not the only people that punch, but we have clubs on the ends of our arms. And so that's how we defend ourselves. And so if you have a lot of upper body strength, especially across the shoulders, and you're heavier, then you can step into the punch and it's a lot more devastating. Now, it is the case that if you look at the statistics for physical altercations in marriage, women attack their husbands more often than the husbands attack their wives. Well, you think, why is that? Well, let's assume that there isn't any reason other than both people in a relationship can get upset, and the women know that if they hit their husbands, nothing's really going to happen, right? Because if you're if you're a woman about that high and your husband is, say, my height, unless you hit me with an object or something that's sharp, the probability that you're going to do me any serious damage is pretty low. You might hurt me, but if I do the reverse and hit you, and I really hit you, and so the reason, at least one of the reasons why women can be more physically aggressive in minor ways in a relationship is because everyone knows, the wife and the husband equally, that the consequence of the physical aggression is much more limited. So men do more serious damage to women, but women are more aggressive in relationships. So that's interesting. So okay, so there's a body size difference that's important, a strength differential that's important. Next thing, I think, so let's assume that the reason that women are higher in sensitivity to negative emotion is because the world is actually more dangerous to women, right? Because that would be the most logical reason why there would be a sex difference in something like fear or sensitivity to punishment. Well, first, there's the danger of physical altercation. Second, there's the sexual danger. So women become sexually vulnerable at puberty. And why do I say vulnerable? Well, it's straightforward. It's because the cost of sex for women is way higher than it is for men. And it certainly has been throughout our evolutionary history. Because if a man has an unwanted sexual encounter, well, then he walks away and maybe he's persecuted by the state or prosecuted by the state for it. But if a woman has an unwanted, unwarranted, or incautious sexual encounter and she ends up pregnant, then, well, in traditional societies, you're just done. And even in modern societies that are rich like ours, I don't have to go into that. It's big trouble. No matter what you do about it, it's big trouble. So being more nervous about that makes perfect sense. But then here's the last thing. And I think that women's nervous systems are not adapted to women. I think women's nervous systems are adapted to the mother-infant dyad. And because you are not the same creature when you have an infant. Not at all. You're way more vulnerable. And it's partly because you have to express the vulnerability of the infant and you also have to care for it, right? So you think about an infant, especially under 9 months. So let's say, how are you going to be wired up if you're going to optimally care for an infant under 9 months? And I'm saying under 9 months because women generally do the bulk of childcare for infants who are under 9 months old. And part of the reason for that, there's a whole host of reasons, but part of the reasons for that obviously is that they breastfeed. But imagine what you need to be wired up biologically in order to care for an infant. First of all, they're very demanding, right? Because they're completely helpless, and they're demanding 24 hours a day, and it's quite a emotional load. And an infant under 9 months is never wrong, right? What you do to an infant under 9 months is when they're in distress, you always respond. You never tell the infant, get your act together and stop whining, right? Which you can do, say, to a child that's 18 months old. You can start having that sort of conversation. But under 9 months, it's like nothing is the infant's fault. It's surrounded in an extraordinarily threatening world, and you have to be responsive to what it needs, regardless of what you want, and you have to be very sensitive to the threats that emerge in the environment. And so I think the price that women pay for that ability to have an intimate relationship with infants in the very earliest stages of development is that their nervous systems are actually wired so that they can perform that role optimally. And the disadvantage to that is that having a temperament like that doesn't work that well when you're dealing with adult men, especially when you're dealing with them in a business environment, because it's not the same thing. Not at all. It's a competitive environment. So, okay, so agreeable people are compassionate and polite. What are disagreeable people like? They're tough-minded, they're blunt, they're competitive, and they won't do a damn thing they don't want to do. So it isn't exactly that they're aggressive, although they will push you the hell out of their way if you're in the way. They're not like volatile like you are if you're high in neuroticism. It isn't defensive aggression, it's more like predatory aggression. It's dominance behavior. And so for someone who's highly disagreeable, they look at the world as a place in which they can compete and win. And I'll tell you a story. I have a friend. I gave him my personality test, the Big 5 aspect scale that Colin DeYoung developed in my lab. And I knew he was a disagreeable guy, and by interacting with him. I mean, he's even rude to people sort of spontaneously on the street. I actually like him quite a bit. He's very, very funny. He's also very conscientious, so you can trust him, but he's disagreeable as hell. And so I gave him this test because I thought it would be funny, and he came out as the most disagreeable person in 10,000. So reasonable in compassion, about 30th percentile, but like 0.001 in politeness. So he's extraordinarily blunt, and he'll just say absolutely anything, no matter how horrible it is. And he was often brought into corporations to sort of clean them up. So if a corporation was tilting and not doing well, they'd bring him in to find out who the useless people were and fire them. And I talked to him about that because I've had the opportunity to have to not have graduate students in my lab, for example, that weren't performing well, and I find it very, very difficult to, dress someone down, and certainly difficult to fire them. I just hate it because I'm actually quite an agreeable person, much to my chagrin. And I asked him about that, and I said, well, what do? You have to fire people all the time. How do you handle that? He says, handle it? I enjoy it. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that someone would have that response. I said, well, what do you mean you enjoy it? He said, look, I go into these companies and I analyze the performance of groups of people, right? And in those groups, there are people who are really striving, really trying hard and working themselves really hard and being productive. And then there's these people that are just doing nothing. They're completely in the way. They don't carry their weight at all. They take advantage every chance they get. And they're always whining about why they can't work. It's like, I find out who they are, I call them into my office, and I tell them exactly what they've been doing. It's like, hit the road, buddy. You've had your run of it. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, I can tell you, I've had situations in my lab where I had underperforming graduate students. And one of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students, because they felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight devalued what they were doing, and that's exactly right. And so this is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait. Because conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit. It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, your mother's sick, and you've got a bunch of family problems, and we all have to take care of each other, and it's no wonder that you're having a rough time. And like, you can't say that one of those attitudes is correct and the other isn't correct. You can't say that. There wouldn't be those two dimensions if there wasn't something correct about both of them. But you can certainly point out that often they conflict, and so the demand for for inclusiveness and unity and care, and the demand for high-level performance in a hierarchical structure. They're very different orientations in the world. And so it's complicated for people who are agreeable and conscientious. And actually, I think often that large corporations and large institutions of any sort run on the unheralded labor of people who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, and they're disproportionately women. And my experience in large institutions has been that if you want to hire someone to exploit appropriately, no, not appropriately, if you want to hire someone to exploit productively, you hire middle-aged women who are hyper-conscientious and who are agreeable, because they'll do everything. They won't take credit for it, and they won't complain. And that's nasty, and I think that happens all the time. And so one of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you also may be loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. So partly what you're doing by attending to your child constantly is noticing where they are in the construction of this hierarchy, and they start way down here, right? And so that's why you play peekaboo, for example. It's like they can do that, and you can, you interact with them because you can watch. You do a little something, and if they respond, you got some sense that you're at the same level. And kids in playgrounds do that with each other right away. So if you see 2 3-year-olds together, say they're fairly sophisticated for 3-year-olds. What they'll do is they'll start playing a little primitive game with each other, like a dog. You know what a dog does when it wants to play? It kind of goes like that. And that's what kids do, and that's what adults do too. It's a play invitation. It's like, I'm ready, but you're smiling. It's not like I'm ready. And so you can tell the difference between a play, fight, and play, and kids can too. So it's an invitation to play. And so if you're interacting with your little kid, they got that play circuit. Man, that thing's in there like when they're from birth, I think, because you can play with a kid right from birth, at least something like peekaboo. And so you're on the same wavelength fundamentally. And then you interact with them and you see if they're following what you're doing. It's what I'm doing when I'm lecturing, more or less. I'm watching you guys and seeing if we're more or less in the same shared space. And we want the space to be expanding. Because if it's just staying the same, well, you might as well play whatever you play on your computer. It has to be expanding. at the same time. That's optimal. And so when you're playing with your kid, you put them on that developmental edge where they're undoing and then rebuilding their little skills. You know, you can do that. Like, I had this memory from when I was a little kid a while back, and I remembered I used to go over to these people's house with my father and my mom, and it was way up in northern Alberta, and these people were Russian immigrants, children of Russian immigrants, and they had a farmhouse way out in the country, way out, by the way, where the railroad actually ended. If you walked north from there, you'd walk until you hit like southern Europe without running into another person. It was way the hell out in the middle of nowhere. And anyways, they had a nice house, like a warm house, you know. They had 3 kids and they were way older than me, but it was a real fun, comfortable place to go. And I used to sit in the living room with my father and his friend, whose name was Nick. And Nick was a really playful guy. I really liked him. He was like my surrogate grandfather. And I don't think I was more than about 3. I'd sit there and I'd try to hit his foot with my fist, and he would be talking to my dad, you know, and my dad would say, Jordan, don't bother Nick. And Nick would say, well, he's not really bothering me. And because Dad was checking it out to see if I was an annoying twerp or if I was a fun kid, you know, because it's a fine line. And so I'd try to hit his foot and he would move it. And I had this memory a while back, and I thought, wow, that was a good memory. And I thought, what is going on there exactly? And I realized, well, he was sharpening me up. You know, it's like I was aiming at something. You're aiming at something. You're pointing your eyes at it. You're pointing your whole damn soul at it. You're aiming at something. And you're trying to get your behaviors and your conceptions in line and organized so that you can attain that aim. That's what people do. You know, we throw rocks at things. We fire arrows at things. We shoot guns at things. We aim at things. Our whole body is that platform for aiming. And I was trying to aim at his feet, and he'd move his feet, you know. But he'd let me hit it now and then. And so let's say you're a rat, okay? Because, like I said, a rat's a good model for a person. Let's say you're a little rat, a juvenile male, and you want to play, because you want to play. And you'll work to play, and that's how we know you want to play if we're experimental psychologists, because you'll button push like mad to get access to an arena where you can wrestle with another little rat. And so rats wrestle just like human beings, and they even pin each other just like human beings, and they love that. And so if you put little rat A in with little rat B, and little rat B is 10% bigger, little rat B can stomp the hell out of little rat A all the time. So they go out there and they have a little dominance competition, and little rat B is going to win because he's bigger. So now he's dominant rat. So then they play and they wrestle, and little rat A loses. And then next time, they both know that little rat A is the inviter because he's subordinate. So he's the one that has to go up to the big rat and go, you ready? And the big rat then will wrestle. However, if you repeatedly pair them, and the big rat doesn't let the little rat win, at least 30% of the time, the little rat won't invite him to play anymore. And that was Jaak Panksepp who figured that out. And that is mind-boggling. Because it tells you, like, there's an ethical basis for play that's so deep that the damn rats, and they're rats, right? Not known for their sense of fair play. The big rat has to let the little rat win 30% of the time, or the little rat will not play anymore. And even rats know that. It's so profound, that discovery. Like, Panksepp discovered the play circuit in mammals. That's a big deal. That's like discovering a whole continent. Like, that's a big deal. He should have got a Nobel Prize for that. And to see that that's built in, that sense of fair play, that's mind-boggling, you know, because that's evidence for the biological instantiation of a complex morality. Fair play. Even if you can win, you shouldn't all the time. Well, so when I'm trying to hit Nick's feet with my hand, like, I'm really paying attention and he's moving it pretty well, but now and then I get to nail it, and I'm feeling pretty good about that, you know. And he makes it a little bit more difficult all the time so that my aim gets better and better, and I'm building up my motor coordination, I'm building up my social skills because I don't hit too hard, and I don't cry when I miss, because that just makes you annoying to play with, right? So I'm learning really complicated things about how to go about finessing my aim, and that's what you're doing with your kids. And what are they aiming at? Well, they aim higher and higher. So when my son was about 2.5, we had him start setting the table. You don't say, you know, you want to take grandma's fine china and go set the table? It's like, no, you don't do that. You say, you know what a fork looks like? He goes, yeah. See, do you know what the forks are? well, that doesn't work because the drawer's way up here, right? So you have to hand him a fork. You say, look, take this fork and go put it on the table. And he's like this high, you know, so he goes over to the table and he puts the fork up here. Can't even see what he's doing. He puts the fork up there, and then, you know, he's reasonably happy with that, and you give him a pat, and then you go and give him a really sharp knife. No, you don't do that. You don't do that. You give him a spoon, and you say, well, go put the spoon beside the fork. And you don't say, look, you stupid kid, you got to leave enough space between the fork and the spoon so the plate can fit there. Don't you know anything? You're stupid. It's like, well, that's right up here, right? You're a bad kid. No, that's bad. You don't do that. You go down here and you say, well, good micro routine adaptation there, chum. Let's try it again. You know, and you build that up, and and you can't extend the kid past his point or her point of exhaustion, because it's got to be a game. And a 2-year-old can probably only do that for, you can watch them, and some are more persistent than others, but 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you're pushing your luck. You can take a 2-year-old to a restaurant for about 40 minutes and expect them to sit and behave. But after that, you know, the will exhausts them. All right. Well, anyways, that's Piaget in his nascent form fundamentally. And so if you remember that diagram and you think about how that would be built from the bottom up and how there would be a stage transition every time those things are learned, you kind of got the essential elements of Piagetian theory. So